Welcome everyone. Bochim Aba'im. I am Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. This is Rebbitzin Katrin, your virtual Rebbitzin. We do have Rabbi's cat Vasya somewhere hidden down there, still with us. So he's becoming more and more needy and is with us pretty much 24/7. But we're very happy to have him with us. And with that, welcome to our podcast, Day Drinking with the Rabbi. It's actually evening here in Germany, so evening drinking with the Rabbi. And I guess we continue with our drinking theme for the last weeks.
Yep, we continue with the nonsense hipster drink. And today...
The translation is nonsense.
Yeah. Today's flavor is passion fruit and lemongrass.
Okay. For those of you seeing this for the first time, these have been pretty spectacular, actually. So
it's a smoothie liqueur, Berlin made.
So you might have to actually visit Berlin in order to get this. And as usually we say a bracha. So if you are joining us with a little l'chaim, l'chaim, l'chaim. And like all of them, it's pretty spectacular. Very refreshing. I would say that these are all summer drinks, very much summer drinks, although our Halloween experimentation. We actually did have a comment from someone in the BeitVirtuali community who appreciated the discussion on Halacha and witchcraft, who actually noted that the ingredients in our green brew last week are very common within certain tinctures. So there it is. I guess let's go ahead and start with acknowledgement of the day. As we go from, there's no way to have a transition from Sam L'Chaim to the acknowledgement that it is November 9th. It is Kristallnacht. And it's worth saying for a second because most people do use or hear Kristallnacht instead of Pogromnacht. And most of my colleagues here in Germany very much prefer the term Pogromnacht, and many of my colleagues outside of Germany. And the reason is quite simple, that the term Kristallnacht was most likely coined by Joseph Goebbels. And so, we're trying not to give a whole lot of posthumous victories there. The Kristallnacht means Night of the Broken Glass, and it was referring to the amount of glass shattered. And usually people think of some deaths and synagogues. I think that the truth of history gets lost in time, because it was more than 91 people dead, which when you have that in comparison to the just under 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust, and the 5+ million Roma Sinti, homosexual communists, Poles, all the other groups that were murdered, it seems like a drop in the bucket. But it was one of the, as the Simon Wiesenthal Center will say, the Holocaust is step 100 in a 100-step process. And, this is 90. But in addition to the more than 91 people killed, 267 synagogues were destroyed, more than 7,000 Jewish shops were either destroyed or mostly destroyed, and more than 30,000 Jewish men were taken to concentration camps on that night. So this is November 9th and 10th, 1938. So way before anyone talking about these issues other than some very frightened Jews in Germany from the Nuremberg laws, things had gone very bad very quickly, and that wasn't a small deal. And so I think we should probably be conscious of the words we use. Pogromnacht. This was a pogrom. This was an anti-Semitic attack against Jews. And especially for my friends who are watching in the United States, 1 out of 4 Jews in the last year has said they have, for the first time in their lives, felt it's no longer safe to be a Jew in the United States. And that is a terrifying number. And I think that Jews are the one group who has been historically oppressed, that it's kind of okay to oppress them because of disagreement against Israel. And I guess I'm not really worried about being controversial in saying that, because it's pretty ugly. And the worst anti-Semitic things that have ever had happened to me were in the United States of America, and much more than the things I've had happen to me in Germany. So anyway, there it is, a little bit of reality. Maybe we should had a little bit more of the mumpets up here tonight, but anyway, we can transition out of that space into continuing our discussion. Everyone, take another shot if you've got an adult beverage in front of you. That's why we do the day drinking. That, or your good non-alcoholic beverage if you prefer, helps us get through the difficult discussions, which I think we're obligated to have.
Well, I mean, somehow it is related to what we already discussed about conversion, because the yeah the history of the Jewish people is part of what you have to engage with when you convert.
Yeah.
And it's often also a topic that is asked by the rabbis, that why do you want to convert if you know that the Jewish people are oppressed?
Yeah.
And so somehow it's related, and
Yeah.
I don't know if someone ever asked this in a Beit Din, as we already talked about at the end of the conversion process.
We have a member of BeitVirtuali that I know for a fact, so not an ordained rabbi, but someone who's acted as a Shlach Tzibur for many years, one of the most knowledgeable Jews that I know. I'm not going to out you. I know that you're listening to this. Who has sat on many Bet Din, and we do know, as we've talked before, that a rabbi is not required for a Beit Din. It's probably, if you're trying to convince someone that your Teuda is legitimate, maybe it's easier with 3 rabbis, but it's absolutely halakhically not required. You just need someone who's knowledgeable, and I can tell you this person's very knowledgeable. And one of the questions that they asked at every Beit Din was, and this is a Reform Beit Din in the United States of America, okay? So to set the stage here, are you willing to be considered a Jew by Hitler's definition? And that is something that I've never actually had the courage to ask in that way. But after this person told me that they use this question, I have found ways to teach around these sorts of questions for awareness. And obviously, I think what they're asking is, when things go bad, the people who hate Jews aren't looking to separate those who were born Jews and those who converted. And are you actually fully aware of that? And I just want to be a geek for a second and question. All right, so apparently our internet this evening is a little bit in and out, so I'll just jump back a little bit to what I was saying. And whenever it cuts out, we'll try to power through it. It's the first time this has happened. You know, we had the great solar flare in the Northern Lights, so maybe we have residual effects from that. Anyway, so a friend of mine, a brilliant rabbi, and I think a very, very fine scholar, asked the question of, okay, did Leo Beck know about what was happening in the concentration and the death camps? And the point that he wanted to make at the beginning is that there is a difference between knowledge and understanding. And I think that we know that, again, but we don't understand that. We can actually say there's a difference between knowledge and understanding, but this is part of how we build compassion for other human beings, but also how we evaluate. I think that everyone who has had any good, decent conversion process, anyone who's taken seriously the gravity of what it means to be a Jew and what it potentially could mean from a historical standpoint, I think that unless you've experienced it yourself, you can know that there are going to be problems, but until you've actually had someone say something anti-Semitic to you, as with any group that has some bias that's against them, I think that until you've actually experienced it yourself, you can say that you know all about it, but of course you can't understand, and that's part of our humility. Of course, I think that part of the more moderate view within that is every single human being on the face of this planet has knowledge of themselves, and the person who's not them does not have knowledge, does not have understanding of what that person's gone through. So I think that this is a human challenge and part of the I-thou relationship that Martin Buber talks about, that how do we have a thou relationship with anyone? And that is to understand that they themselves have their own complete unique experience in and of themselves as an individual, and that we can never understand that. And so part of the beauty of life is coming to as much knowledge as we can, and then as we are able to develop intimacy in profound ways with human beings, in all the ways that we can develop intimacy, develop the little understanding that we can, and then have compassion for other human beings. So that being said, I think that that question even being asked, a lot of people would say, yes, I fully accept the idea that I'm converting into a religion that can be highly problematic. I know of very few people who've really absorbed that on the level of understanding, because how can one unless one? And this is what a lot of born Jews go through and say, hey, listen, and a good friend of mine on one of my previous rabbinical positions talked to me several times, says, I just don't get it. I don't understand it, because when I was a kid, I was the Jew. I was harassed every day on the way. And anyone who hasn't had that experience, I just don't know how they can relate to me. And the answer is, well, I've never had children, but yet I've done counseling for families all my life. So how can I relate to that? You do the best you can. You have compassion. You understand there's always a bridge between what you actually can understand of the person, but use your best knowledge and your best compassion, your best humanity, and your best tools. And if all those, as well as the intentionality is well placed, then you can be a very good therapist. So in the same way that if all those tools are in the good place, well, Jews have had radically different experiences depending on where they've lived, where they have converted to Judaism or been born Jews throughout all of Jewish history. And so anyone who says, my experience, you have to have knowledge of my experience to be Jewish, well, that's unacceptable, ultimately. I think it's acceptable as a beginning of a dialogue. It's unacceptable for definition of Judaism, because I think, like I said 2 weeks ago, a Moroccan Jewish family won't necessarily have had someone who died in the Holocaust, and they certainly won't understand the absolute delicious nature of gefilte fish. Thank goodness, right? My very Moroccan Jewish loving wife here.
Yeah, but I find this interesting that that you actually experienced or heard of this in the United States and not in Germany, because I think to ask the question in a Beit Din is maybe more appropriate in Germany, and I'm wondering why it is not asked.
I can give a reason for it, and I think that, so we said this was a no-holds-barred conversation. I have never been in a Beit Din in the United States where the Beit Din has said no to potential conversion candidates. And whether that's good or bad, or whether people slip through that if I were the Rosh Beit Din, that I would have said I'm not comfortable with this, that's a different discussion altogether that I don't even think I'm willing to have, because I think that there's issues of anonymity there, and anyone watching this who knows that I was on their Beit Din, I don't want to go in that direction. I have been in a Beit Din, well, several times in this country, where people have not gone through. They have not had a Teuda signed. And so I think that the difference is in Germany, there's less people by far. There's only one non-Orthodox Beit Din in this entire country. There's one Orthodox Beit Din in this entire country, and they won't meet unless they have a representative of the Chief Rabbi of Israel as part, if that's changed, and anyone's listening to that, feel free to correct me, but I believe that was the case in 2014. I believe it's still the case now. There is absolutely a Rosh Beit Din in highly respected rabbi, always for many years. It was one of the greatest respected Reform rabbis in this country, who sat on the head of the Beit Din for a very, very long time. And the amount of people that are sent to Beit Din are a tiny, tiny, tiny amount, even per capita, compared to the United States. So I think that that's part of it, that the roadblocks put into place are so much more profound, and because the Holocaust is everywhere around you, you literally stumble over Stolperstein all the time within German cities, that it's so much harder to even get into a conversion class, that by the time you actually get to the one Beit Din who's very, very strict, even a Reform or a non-Orthodox Beit Din, that it's almost not necessary. But so many people comparatively come through a Beit Din in the United States that the question, and again, my friend who asked that, I was blown away at the courage at asking that question. At the same time, I thought, yeah, that's worth asking. I'd like to see if someone has thought through that. I'd like to see if that's been discussed, because if it hasn't been discussed, then the underlying spirit of the Talmud and its discussion on conversion, do you not understand the plight of the people of Israel? Then that critical central point to the entire discussion within the Talmud has been completely ignored. So I fully honor that question being asked. If I have concerns on has this education addressed these sorts of issues. In Germany, there's no way you can get to a Beit Din without having wrestled with the Holocaust.
Okay, interesting. And as we already talk about the Beit Din, and as you mentioned, there's one in Germany, one non-Orthodox Beit Din.
Just non-Orthodox, we mean conservative or Masorti, Reform, Reconstructionalist, Renewal, essentially, is what we're looking at. But I just want to caution everyone, if you are listening to this and you're American and you know what Reform means and conservative means and Orthodox means, throw it out the window before you come into Germany, because the Reform synagogue in Berlin is separate seating with a pipe organ and a choir. It's Reform because it was Reform tradition via 1920. And there's two egalitarian synagogues, one Hüttenweg outside of town, which is, it calls itself Reform, but it's a World Union. It's liberal is actually what they call themselves. So it's part of Liberale Juden in Germany. It's a World Union community. And then in Berlin proper, the only egalitarian synagogue is conservative or Masorti. So if you go to the Reform community expecting to have an American experience, then you're going to be terrified when you are asked to have the women sit over here and the men sit over there. So, definitions change for very important historical reasons. And if anyone's curious, we can absolutely have a discussion on the difference in Germany to the United States. And my video that I'm putting up tomorrow or the next day will be a first of a two-parter on understanding the streams of Germany, more an American perspective on that. So if you want to know more about Germany, you've got two experts right here, so you might as well have that. But yes, anyway, so the Beit Din, the non-Orthodox Beit Din then includes the German versions of Masorti, Reform, Liberal, Renewal, Reconstructionalist. And we do have people in this country serving that have been ordained at Aleph, at JTS, HUC, Abraham Geiger Colleg. I don't think there's any Leo Beck people serving in. The rector of the Geiger Colleg studied at Leo Beck, but wasn't ordained there. But from all over the non-Orthodox world. So when we say the Allgemeine Rabbiner Conference Beit Din is non-Orthodox, we mean it's really the breadth of everything but Orthodoxy.
Yes, but my question was that obviously in the non-Orthodox world since 1972, I believe, women are ordained as rabbis, and
really since 1972, that was our first.
Wasn't it? Well, in 1935, yes, but I'm talking about
yes.
Non-Orthodox.
Yes.
Regina Jonas, who was the first rabbi ordained in Germany in 1935, actually considered herself, Jewish, like just Jewish.
Yeah, she didn't. She
put
a denomination to
right.
who she was, right?
But she came from an Orthodox family, right. And so.
Discussion for a different day.
Anyway, so women are ordained in the non-Orthodox world, and even in the Orthodox world, we have the Yeshivat Maharat for the Orthodox, that also just a few years ago ordained Sarah Hurwitz as first as a Maharat and then changed the title to Rabbah. And
do you want to just define those terms for everyone?
No.
Okay.
You can.
Well, it's Maharat's focusing more on the roots around teacher, which is what a rabbi is, whereas Rav is Rabbah is a female version of the traditional male term in Hebrew language. Right. So it was a switch from, actually it's really interesting, something that I actually profoundly disagree with what happened. Up until 2016, most people don't know this, women who are ordained at HUC, their smicha, their ordination document, had a different text than the male. And I actually profoundly disagree with that. So mine, I'm not ordained through HUC, I'm ordained through Abraham Geiger Colleg. Mine says Moreno Horav, so our teacher, the rabbi. And I believe the text used for my colleagues at HUC up until 2016 was Morat Rav, I believe, instead of Moreno HaRav. So that was changed, which I think it should be changed because our teacher, the rabbi, is a term of profound respect. And I think that even you don't have to worry about the gendering of the language when you're saying Moreno at that point. I guess you go to Mauritania or something like that. But it's, interestingly enough, when we see the evolution, even very recently, we still see evolution. In
Right.
these
I mean,
terms.
but that's why
Thank goodness.
I find this really complicated because every stream or wherever you were ordained from, women actually prefer different titles, so
True.
you basically can only say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, but what I wanted to say is that women are obviously ordained, even in the Orthodox movement, and slowly. But are they allowed in a Beit Din? Is there a halachic obstacle, maybe, or is it? Do you think from a halachic standpoint, women are allowed to be on a Beit Din, and is the conversion then legitimate?
So this is a question that came from a BeitVirtuali member, and I think that before I even start jumping into it, I know that there are probably some people watching this who are very uncomfortable with the question. And my response to that is always, well, when we feel discomfort, then that means that whatever our consciousness is built on, we're having someone challenge what we're holding to be true. And I hope everyone who watches this understand that I believe that whoever and of whatever gender someone is ordained a rabbi, if they've gone through and they have that smicha, they are equally a rabbi and equally able to serve as a rabbi. And I would honor them equally as a rabbi. And hopefully I have always honored every rabbi that I've met, regardless of who they are, equally as a rabbi. That being said, why would we even think of addressing a question like this? Because I think a lot of people might say anyone who would believe that a woman could not serve on a Beit Din would be backwards. And I think that, first of all, we have to recognize that this question was not settled until the last 50 years. This is, in rabbinical history, this is a few minutes ago. And so when we think of the things that have been settled law, we have fantasies around how long that's been the case. And again, Sally Priceland ordained in 1972, Amy Asen in 1982, I believe it was, within the conservative movement. Jackie Tabak not long after that within the movement for Reform Judaism in Great Britain. One of the Gedolim, also, by the way, the Rosh Beit Din of the Reform movement in the United Kingdom. So that's part of the answer to the question. So there's multiple things that have to be thrown around here. And one of them is, if you have a female rabbi signing a tehodah, and that person with the conversion document is trying to get into an Orthodox synagogue, it actually doesn't matter if a female or a male person signed that. Right. It's not going to be an accepted tehodah. So that's the first thing to get around, is accepted by whom, valid by whom. And I'm going to try to nail this a lot better in the video that I'm doing this week on the streams of Judaism. But within the question of what does Jewish law say about that, the Reform movement is going to say, listen, times have changed, which they have, and Zmanim Nishtanu is actually a halakhic principle. There's a recognition that times have changed, and as times have changed, the role of women in society have changed. And so that is the underlying reasoning in a lot of Reform Judaism. I'm not trying to paint too broad of a brush, there is nuance there. Within Orthodox Judaism, that is not traditionally what a rabbi is, so therefore that's been a lot harder to catch on, and therefore ordination is happening relatively slowly. And within the conservative movement, and I will go ahead and link that probably tomorrow at the bottom of this video, because if you actually want to really get into understanding the evolution of halacha and our understanding around women, the conservative movement, as they were wrestling with could women be ordained, the idea of the conservative movement is they are today mostly egalitarian. I say mostly because there's a lot of autonomy within shuls, and there are shuls that we call conservadox that are still separate seating and that sort of thing. But essentially, it's an egalitarian movement. Most conservative shuls are egalitarian, but they still consider themselves a halakhic movement. So if they make the decision to ordain women, then they're going to go through and write up how that can work within halakha. And a lot of the rabbis who voted against the responsa didn't vote against it because they didn't think women should be ordained. They voted against it because they agreed with the Reform movement, saying times have changed. Let's not mess around with this. Let's acknowledge that the role of women in the Talmud was different than the role of women now. Let's stop messing around, and let's just acknowledge that Judaism has always had if we didn't allow times to change, then we shouldn't have Judaism because we don't have a temple where we can slaughter animals and worship God through that, and we don't have a Kohen Hagadol. So, anyone out there who is saying you can't change tradition, you can't change Jewish law, you don't know anything about Judaism. Judaism started as a temple state with a king, a high priest, a temple, and a sacrificial cult, and now we're sitting here eating latkes and mumbling through prayers so that no one can understand what we're saying. We've changed quite a bit of what we're doing, and the only sacrificial meat that we have is when I make a darn fine brisket, let me tell you. So I'll get off my soapbox right now. But so the conservative movement really fought with that. And there were some incredibly progressive people who voted against women being ordained, or at least the response to it, because they did not want to say we have to relate only to halakha. Now, this is jumping into a completely different discussion than I guess about conversion, but it really ties into it, because the biggest mistake that is made, and one of the reasons that I think that this is so important to talk about in this podcast and when we talk about conversion, is because it's not just Orthodox Jews who sit there and ask the question, are women rabbis legitimate? We know very well that there have been hiring prejudices in the conservative and reform movements over time. It's less so now, but in the 80s, definitely, in the 90s and the 2000s, absolutely. So before we think that we're above it, we need to acknowledge that that's not the case. I know for a fact that there were conservative synagogues 20 years ago that actually had for rabbinical search committees, will you allow women candidates to apply for this job? So before we get too excited about this, this is not a done deal within progressive Judaism as well. And this idea that a rabbi has to have a beard is even as scraggly and awful as this one is still deep down in the collective consciousness of even very, very progressive people. And I think it's even worse because it's deep down and people won't admit it to themselves. And if they won't admit it to themselves, then it becomes repressed and it becomes acted out upon in different ways, and passive aggressiveness and that sort of thing. And a lot of my female colleagues have been treated horribly, absolutely horribly. And for all of you watching out there, if you refer to every male rabbi you meet as rabbi and a female rabbi by your first name, then that's how you know if you actually, and that's actually one of the most common things that we have happen. So I think this is important to talk about because part of the problem, part of the mistake that Reform Judaism made in stepping back from having a day-to-day engagement with halakha is that halakha absolutely supports egalitarianism with women. It's all throughout the Talmud. It got changed over time. It became more conservative. You've got people like the Chatam Sofer at the end of the 19th century who just got basically misogynistic. But the original discussions were very much, I don't want to say that it was kumbaya and it was a paradise for egalitarianism, but all these things that we think about as being the purview of Orthodox men, wearing a tallis today is something that you definitely see inside American synagogues, Reform synagogues all the time, and conservative. But go to a European Reform synagogue and you tell me how many women are wearing a tallis. Very, very few. Conservative, yes. Reform, absolutely no. It's actually sometimes discouraged. It's very uncommon. We still have a long way to go. And why? Because a tallis is something that belongs to a man. Now, that's not true. But what does the Talmud actually say regarding a tallis? It actually refers to the prohibition of women wearing men's clothing. And so if a tallis is an article of clothing associated with men, then that's the issue. Although the Talmud specifically says it's not forbidden of a woman. So start at that point. When it comes to tefillin, explicitly, women are allowed to lay tefillin if they wish. And the statement is maybe they should avoid it, however, because of guf lo nakia, which is okay, this is our podcast. It is what it is. It literally means women shouldn't do it because they're more liable to pass gas while wearing it, which is unholy. Welcome to the Talmud, folks. It's lots of fun sometimes. To which I think, what guys and women did these people in the Talmud? Yeah. No. If you get curious about that stuff, we can discuss it more. There's actually underlying reasons for that. So, all these things that we see as man-oriented, a woman reading Torah. Obviously, in order to be ordained as a rabbi, you should probably be able to read from Torah. And every single Orthodox synagogue that I've served in, with one exception, has almost immediately, when they found out that I personally support egalitarianism, asked, well, can a woman touch a Torah scroll when she's on her period? Doesn't that... And that is the ignorance right there. That is and it blows me away. The Talmud says nothing can make Torah impure. And so this concept of blood and impurity that still believed somehow in the 21st century is profound ignorance. And it's still out there, and I've heard it in Reform synagogues as well. So those are those little tiny ones. The big ones, of course, are the conflation between exempt and forbidden. And I hope that most people understand that the basic underlying issue with egalitarianism in Rabbinical Judaism is that there are certain, not all, time-based mitzvot, so a mitzvah that has to be done between a certain hour, that women are exempt from. And why are they exempt from it? Because back in the times of the Talmud, division of duties in a relationship were set in stone. A woman would have to take care of children, and a man would not be the one taking care of the children. So inside the house was the halakhic domain of the woman. Outside the house is the halakhic domain of the man. And so there is a halakhic principle of do not be a burden to the community. If you were to say you have to show up at prayer at this hour and this hour, and you've got a baby, that would be horribly unfair. So that is where halacha came from. And if we're feeling very uncomfortable right now, well, just about everything that happened before the Enlightenment should make us feel uncomfortable. Just about anything that happened before 1950 should make us feel uncomfortable, because we're just talking about how the world is and was. And if we can't do that, then I guess we're kind of lost. So the problem is that got conflated over time from women are exempt to women are forbidden. And that women are forbidden is a medieval, late medieval, and then moving to the 19th century sort of thing. And that is where the conservative movement said, listen, we recognize that halacha evolved through these things, but it evolved for specific Christian Europe societal issues. And so we can go ahead and reject those as not being indicative of 19th, 20th, and 21st century, especially 20th and 21st century Judaism. But somehow people still have it stuck in their mind that being exempt means being forbidden. And the question that I hear by more well-meaning people within Orthodoxy is, well, wait a second here. If a woman isn't obligated to prayer, and I am, if I say Amen to someone saying a blessing who is not obligated to say the blessing, does my Amen count? Now, if you're not coming from a halakhic world or a world where Jewish prayer is something that is taken at that kind of literal sort of level, this seems like an absurd statement. But either we try to find people where they are and understand their mindset. There are many Jews, especially in Orthodoxy, but also outside of Orthodoxy, where prayer and obligation to prayer is a real tangible thing. And that means if I am required to say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu lecholam, then fill in the blank at the end of that one, and that's part of my daily obligation. If someone who's not obligated to say that says it, and my response is Amen, have I fulfilled my obligation? That is the question. And the answer actually goes back to 16th century, which is really cool. The Shulchan Aruch, the book that tells us what halacha is normative for the majority of Jews since that time throughout all of history, in the section on Hanukkah, talks about how lighting the Hanukkah candles are a time-based mitzvot in the Talmud, but by the time the Shulchan Aruch was written, it was a universally performed mitzvah by men and women. And here's the statement. So this is not in the Shulchan Aruch. It is one of the two major commentators. So we've got the text in the middle, and then we've got the text on the side. I don't remember if it's the Magen Avraham or the Magen David. It's one of the texts on the side. It says, if someone obligates themselves to a mitzvah, then they are obligated to the mitzvah. And that becomes a central point within the conservative response to that one. So that's the first answer, is it literally, the conservative movement used to have, for a very short period of time, they would ask women, have you obligated yourself to the mitzvot before they were counted in the minyan? Thank goodness that stopped, because I hope we can all see how problematic that was, but it's coming from that place. And what I've always said is a woman should be equally able to obligate herself to the mitzvot and not follow them as men are. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about human standards as times change. Let's be on, if I myself, it's like, again, going through conversion, you've got the person who's the born Jew, the person who's converting, the person who's a born Jew says you need to learn all about kashrut while I'm eating my BLT. Let's call the hypocrisy what it is, and let's get both people trying to find their equal space. So the question that came out was, since the laws of conversion were discussed at a time when women weren't ordained, does that then mean that a woman can serve on a Beit Din that's dealing with conversion? And the answer is that's why we have responsa, because there were a lot of things that were not talked about during the times of the Talmud because times were different. But as times change, we then discuss it, and then that becomes a part of the body, the cloud of discussion of Jewish law. And so within the response of the movements that would accept me as some level of halakhic authority, so within non-Orthodox Judaism, the responses say, yes, a woman may be a rabbi, which means she can equally serve on a Beit Din, which I think most people, again, know. But hopefully now we can actually understand that we're just not making stuff up as well. This is deep within Judaism, and this goes a long way back. And unfortunately, people tried to turn that around. Men, at some point, tried to turn that around. But also men and women who wrote the Talmud, and it was men and women, by the way, at the beginning understood something slightly different. And then that was a little bit more egalitarian, which sometimes we lose that a little bit. And I think we've corrected that. That's the last point I want to make. A lot of people don't actually realize that halacha can change. I think I already gave the example. It was Jewish law that you had to bring a sacrifice to the temple. We don't do that anymore. So if Jewish law couldn't change, then, what do we see that? Well, we've got the Levirate marriage issue, for example. So in Levirate marriage, if your brother dies, you are obligated to marry your brother's wife. That hasn't happened in a very long time. Now there's a replacement ceremony. Another example that's hardcore must happen from the Torah is the Jubilee year, every 49 years. The problem is if you have a Jubilee year, then people would stop paying off their debts a few years beforehand, knowing that all their debts are going to be forgiven. It would be the breakdown of any formal economic system. So that was nullified as well by Hillel in the 1st century BCE. So halakha absolutely changes over time, and written into halakha itself is the concept of a tikkun. Okay, tikkun olam, the healing of the world. A tikkun means to repair. So we literally have this idea that if halakha is broken, if it doesn't work, we have the obligation to repair it. The most famous one is the tikkun. I always forget if it's Rabbeinu Gershon or Rabbeinu Tam. It's Tosafot. It's one of the two of them. 1,000 years ago, gave the tikkun, not a response, a tikkun to make polygamy illegal within Judaism. And a lot of societal reasons why that happened, but that was a correction of halakha, not done by a Reformed Jew in the 20th century. So evolution does happen to our tradition, and that's the first thing that we have to get over, is this idea that, okay, well, somehow the only Orthodox Jews, even if I'm Reform, somehow I'm not really, really authentic because I don't wear a black hat or a shtreimel and piss. And, well, 800 years ago, neither did any other Jew on the face of this planet. It's kind of like looking at a movie of Scottish rebellion with everyone wearing a kilt, and the movies from 600 years ago, and no one wore a kilt 600 years ago. It's a much newer invention than that. So, we have to actually understand the time that things came. This idea that we've only started changing things in the last 100 years is absurd. Judaism has survived because it constantly modifies itself. It constantly also asks questions on, should we modify ourselves? Do we know what we're modifying? We discuss it, and what are the repercussions? But I think that with even orthodoxy, in small leaps and bounds, recognizing that there's an absurdity to not having egalitarianism. And there is an absurdity to it. I mean, if I go to a synagogue that's Orthodox and I'm serving as their rabbi or as their cantor, I will respect their local customs, certainly. At the same time, if they ask me what I think about it, I will tell them what I think about it and why I think that. So yes, a woman can serve on a Beit Din, and that is a legitimate conversion that will not be accepted as legitimate outside of non-Orthodox Judaism any more than any other conversion outside of Orthodox Judaism will be accepted inside of Orthodox Judaism.
Right. I mean, I also find this, in general, just very important that women are A, rabbis, and B, also sit in a Beit Din. Because, especially because we talked about that women are the majority of converts. A female rabbi maybe understands your problems, your questions as a woman more than a man maybe has an insight or whatnot, because just for practical reasons,
Well, I mean, one of the things that, you can see within Judaism an underlying archetypal pattern that I think is really powerful. And it's going to get a little esoteric, but I think this is really important. Judaism, if you go back far enough, so Proto-Judaism, before we called it Judaism, worshipped both gods and goddesses, and eventually got down to one god and one goddess, and then eventually they got down to just one god. So that was an evolutionary process. We have this idea of Abraham, and then all of a sudden, okay, everyone just believes in one God and only one God. Even the Torah doesn't say that. The Torah has very clearly, who is like you, eternal, among all the other gods. The very first statement of there is only one God and nothing else comes around the time of the destruction of the temple, especially after the destruction of the temple. Second Isaiah is where we start getting those sorts of visions. So we're talking 5th, 6th century BCE is the first time we get a direct statement. But that means that within Judaism, we used to have a concept of sacred feminine, and sacred feminine was ripped out of our tradition. For good or for ill, whatever that is within Judaism that doesn't see God as having human attributes, then you would actually include male and female concepts within that, which is what Kabbalah does. But the sacred feminine was completely destroyed, and you saw that within Christianity as well. So what did Christianity do? Christianity, actually within Catholicism, then elevated Mary to a much higher position than a human position. That was an attempt to reestablish sacred feminine within. Again, this is an archetypal sort of level. We're stepping out of Judaism into academia for a second here. Judaism, how did it do that? Well, one of the ways that it did it was including mysticism in everyday Judaism. We don't think about that very much, but what's your favorite prayer on Friday evening services? Did it happen to have the words Lecha Dodi in it? Lecha Dodi is going out and greeting the Sabbath bride as she comes in to join with us in a marriage dance that makes us complete. Because Shabbat is where we experience completeness. Why is that so important? Because that is how we slowly reintegrated the concepts of sacred feminine. And now, we've done that through once Judith Butler and people, Judith Plaskow and people like that worked really hard to add things like the imoteno with avoteno and the prayers and that sort of thing. You also have balanced language, and we talked about this a few weeks ago with Torah Ta and how I felt about various midrashim, and I'll link that if you don't know what I'm talking about. It was actually very controversial and no one disliked the video. So there it is. But what's come about today is a correction of epic proportions. The fact that Reform, Renewal, Reconstructionist, and Conservative Judaism have as many female leaders as they do, but also that so many people are converting that are women as well. There's a recognition, a draw as well. The sacred feminine existing within Judaism makes it more accessible. And why is that important? Well, every human being is going to relate to the divine in a slightly different way. And the more people we have in that dialogue, the broader sense we have of the divine. If there's anything that we do poorly, it's letting God out of a tiny little box. Why you never hear me gender the eternal, right? See what I just did there? If you hear me say him or her, that's because I'm making a point, not because I'm actually trying to add any attribute there whatsoever. But the more diverse we are in Judaism, as long as we still have that arm deep in tradition and it remains Judaism, the more we're able to explore exactly that. And what you're going to have among female writers, female converts, you're going to have an expansion of the understanding of the depth of this experience, the depth of these prayers. It's the reason we have a women's Torah commentary. It's not meant to take place of anything else. It is yet another addition to the thousands of years of interpretive tradition. And the more we hear these diverse voices, the larger our view of the eternal is. And that's maybe one of the biggest gifts that we have within that diversity. But I don't know if Judaism had no egalitarian movement whatsoever, if that would be the case that you would have. That being said, I have talked to many converts, female converts, into Orthodox Judaism, or into Judaism via the gateway of Orthodoxy as well. And I think that that's really hard for people to understand who are in egalitarian versions, why that would be the case. That's a discussion for a different day. Why does Judaism, even in a very traditional form, appeal to women if it's not egalitarian? And I'm not actually the person to answer that question. That would be really good for other people to ask and answer.
Yeah. So I have a final question that I think is also very important, and that is the question, problem slash challenge of your birth family. So obviously the Torah tells us we have to honor our mother and father, and
Great question.
How do we deal with it if you convert? How should you kind of, I guess, how can you deal with the challenge? Can you prepare people with the challenges that occur, and what's your experience?
Look, I can tell you what I've done, and I don't know if I'm going to make a claim that I've done it the right way. One of the things that I always offer to my conversion candidates is if their parents of any age, I've actually met with parents between 40 and 80. If any of their parents are really disturbed by what's going on, and if they want to talk to me, and not that many people have taken me up on it, but some. But oftentimes, families themselves will have a difficult time depending on the religious beliefs of the family. Mm-hmm. So if you are coming from a more fundamentalist Christian background, the belief might be that you are leaving Jesus behind and you're going to hell. And I've heard that articulated. My message to those families is usually I hope you can understand that God is big enough to deal with everyone's paths here and not just your own path. And I've got different ways of saying that. But from the converts' point themselves, there are a couple things I focus on. And it really depends on if they have children or not, because that's where the issues are going to be. Because if you convert, and this is my recommendation, and boy, oh boy, colleagues of mine have gotten in trouble for even discussing this, I highly recommend that you stop celebrating Christian holidays, even as a cultural thing. That you stop celebrating Christmas and you stop celebrating Easter, even if they were Thanksgiving, different thing altogether. But why do I do that? Because I'm an awful, awful, horrible person and I'm trying to have a war on Christmas, right? No, that's not it at all.
You're the Grinch.
I'm the Grinch. I'm obviously the Grinch. And actually, Christmas decorations before November 1st. I think it's before December 1st, but before November 1st. Yeah, just stop. Just stop. Anyway, Hanukkah's very early this year, though, so that's a different thing altogether. But the reason I say that is not because I think Christmas is an awful holiday and because I'm so concerned with the consumerism or because I'm trying to turn someone against their Christian relatives. It's because you actually have to work hard to rebuild relationships with the Jewish holidays. Mm-hmm. Everything that people, and I've heard people say, well, I don't want to give up Christmas because I miss the smell of the pine trees. Okay, have you ever sat in a sukkah? Mm. You want the smell of the pine trees around you? Then use pine trees as your schach. But unless you forced yourself to do that, then it becomes training wheels. And I know that that's awful, but there is a historical precedent to this. There's actually a dark underbelly that I never tell my conversion students at this point. In the 4th century, the beginning of institutionalized anti-Semitism was after Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Many Christians were still going to Jewish festivals, to Sukkot, to Passover, because these festivals were much older. They were very mature. Cool ritual is cool ritual. And Christmas and Easter were new ritual. And so people were still going to their friends' Passover Seders. And this was seen as a challenge to the church. And so the church the emperor put it to the church to say, how do we stop this? And so a person named John Chrysostom, listen, you can read all this anywhere on the internet. All of his works are still available, was charged with stopping that. And so John Chrysostom quoted some stuff from the Torah, from the Christian Bible, and put together such wonderful statements as the filthy, horrible, awful Jews. And after John Chrysostom, the first Torah and the first Talmud burnings happened, and the proto-Talmud, but the texts of Judaism and burning of synagogues and that sort of thing. And his edicts and basically his perspective, the charge of deicide, that Jesus was killed by the Jews, that charge was only revoked under Nostra Aetate in the 60s in the Catholic Church. So, why does anti-Semitism still exist? You've got 1600 years of it as institutionalized. But the point was, holidays are that thing that it's really comforting. And until you find a way to put meaning in a new series of holidays, it's really hard to do. And we think back, if someone is converted to Judaism, those childhood Christmas experiences are those warm experiences. But the thing is, Christmas is not a Jewish holiday. End stop. It's not a Jewish holiday. So if you're converting to Judaism, but you're saying, I need my Christmas, then I'm going to question why you think you need to convert to Judaism. Because Judaism is very much living in the Jewish calendar, which doesn't mean Christmas. And Hanukkah is not the Jewish Christmas. I would say Sukkot is a much more related thing there. And so that is one thing. But what about the kids? So what I've always said is this: listen, this is an educational opportunity par excellence. Your kids are going to say, why do grandma and grandpa have a Christmas tree and why don't we? And for whatever reason, people are terrified of these conversations. I love these conversations with kids. Kids are smarter than heck. Why do we not have conversations with these brilliant humans that are curious and are willing to be in dialogue, much more than adults are? The kids will ask that. I've had so many parents saying, I'm afraid to have that question. Why? Talk. I love these. I've had many of these conversations with kids. And the answer is because grandma and grandpa have a different religion than we have, and that religion has different holidays. And when you go with grandma and grandpa, you get to celebrate their holidays with them. And we support that completely because we love you and we love grandma and grandpa. And look at the opportunity for kavod amacha ve'avacha, respect your mother and your father, that we just threw in to our relationship. Well, then why don't we do it at home? Because you get to go to grandma and grandpa to do that at home. We celebrate these holidays, and these are the fun things that we get out of that. But it's not just about fun. It's about remembering, and it's about everything is a moment for reflection and a moment for education. And so, yeah, I've seen people in pain over and over again, but I have to be really strict and stringent and a little bit obnoxious about this one. If we celebrate Christmas in our home because we're afraid to talk to our children, it's worth a second thought about that one. Why are we afraid to talk to our children? If we're doing it because we need that holiday as a crutch for emotions we have, then quite frankly, we have not worked hard enough to find that meaning within Jewish tradition, because Jewish traditions are profoundly beautiful in their depth. And if we haven't found it in our shul, then, well, if you're in America, there's many other shuls. That's what shul shopping is all about. Not that I think it should be a consumer activity, but do it yourself. Build the sukkah yourself. If you don't like the way that Passover is being done at your synagogue, then make your Passover Seder exactly what you want it to be and create. We all have the ability to make responsible decisions where instead of saying someone else has to entertain me or someone else has to make me feel better, I take responsibility for creating something that's meaningful to me and to my family. But yeah, the holidays are a really difficult one, but I've drawn a really strict line. But with families, honor the family. Grandma and grandpa have different beliefs. Well, what if grandma and grandpa say that, say nasty things about Judaism? Well, that's a different discussion altogether and probably out of the preview for this one. Every conversion candidate that I've ever worked with who has come from a Christian family, I spend a lot of time talking about the movement from Christianity to Judaism and the implications of that. And that takes a little while. There's some wonderful books out there like Lawrence Kushner's Judaism for Christians. It's a very short book. It's like 90 pages long. I've recommended that for a lot of families so that they can read that, but also a lot of people converting from Christianity to be able to talk with their families about it. And I guess maybe that's the final thing to say is if we are saying we're strong enough to enter into the Jewish religion, which contains all these problematic things in history, we should be able to develop the strength to be in dialogue with people who ask us questions about Judaism, even if that's family. And if you're in a conversion class right now, or if you're listening to this 10 years from now and you found it because the word conversion is under a hashtag, and if you're not comfortable having that conversation with your family, well, if it's a situation of violence or something like that, I'm not talking about that. But if it's just we haven't developed our skills on being able to have uncomfortable conversations, then start off by writing down, what are the things that if I'm asked this question, I wouldn't know how to answer? And then ask your rabbi, or send a questionnaire to BeitVirtuali and we'll talk about it, or ask for a book recommendation. But isn't that an opportunity to say, okay, I don't know how to talk about Christmas and Judaism. I don't know how to talk about Jesus within a Jewish view. So guess what? Many books about the Jewish view of Jesus. Many good ones. Many bad ones, by the way. But many good books about the Jewish view of Jesus. Isn't all of this a great opportunity just to say, I need to learn more? So I'll leave it at that. That's actually, I think we've hit way past an hour again. I don't know. I can't even see the clock right now. Are we at an hour?
We're at an hour, yeah.
Wow, beautiful. So I guess since we've been talking about conversion for 3 weeks with a little hiatus of Halloween there, the last thing I always tell a conversion candidate before I send them to a Beit Din is one of the questions I'm going to ask them in the Beit Din is, what are you reading now and what are you going to read next week? Mm-hmm. So conversion is not the end of a path, it's the beginning. And from a different perspective, all Jews who are living a Jewish life made a conversion decision in their life. If you're a born Jew and you're not from a shtetl and you are going to shul and engaging in Judaism, engaging in Jewish prayer and Jewish festivals, not just bagels and latkes. So I think that if you're bagels and latkes, Jewish identity, but not engaging in religion, then you're missing out, because it is, as you said at the very beginning, your people shall be my people and your God shall be my God. It's a peoplehood and a religion. But if you are engaging in Judaism as an adult, then you've made a decision to do that no different than someone who's converted to Judaism. It's different pathways, but it's still, everyone has made a decision, a conscious decision at some point who was an adult. And that would be the question that I would always have. What are you reading now? And what are you going to read? Yes, I know we've got our stack of novels that we haven't read, but Judaism means we're constantly putting more information in us. Whether we're converting to it or whether we have chosen as an adult to live a religious Jewish life, what are we reading right now? And if you're guilty right now on that one, at least have the book on your bedside. Have something that you're reading. I mean, I know it's on our bedsides. You know, we've got the stuff that we're actually reading, and we've got the stuff that we wish we were reading. And, you know, I'm pretty knowledgeable in a few small areas, but the stuff that I don't know, you know, obviously you can fill libraries with it in the most literal sort of way, because I haven't read all those books. So what are you reading right now? If you are working towards conversion, hopefully you're reading through the books that your rabbi is having you read. If you just got through it and you're not reading about Judaism right now, why? What stopped you from, you wanted to convert for some reason. Hopefully it had to do with something being really cool within this religion, excitement. Did the excitement go after the Beit Din? Did the excitement go? If it did, I'm sorry. I know some people for whom it did for a variety of reasons, but it's still your responsibility to find that spark yourself. That's between you and the eternal. So as it says in Pirkei Avot, one of the first responsibilities that we learn from Torah being passed to us is we have to get a teacher that we can learn from. We have to find someone with whom to study, chavruta. So find someone to be in a book club with and go through Jewish texts together. And those two things will make us more generous in how we judge other people. I guess the 3 things right there are kind of the secret to life. Yeah. We spend a lot of money trying to buy books, and there it is right there. Learn from someone, study with someone, and be generous in how we judge other people. That's the truth of conversion right there. There it is. We have no idea what we're going to talk about next week, so send in your questions. Write down at the bottom here. Put them in. You'll notice, for those of you who've tried to write letters back and forth with me in the past, that I'm the worst correspondent in the world, but I answer everything that's posted on YouTube so far. I guess if this channel explodes, then I don't know if I'll be able to do that. But send in your questions, even the hard ones. We, I guess, are willing to talk about anything. Last thing out there, we just finished with our first adult education. It was so much fun. The last class went an hour and a half over. It's okay. Most people couldn't stay. I just kept on recording it so people can get through all the material. Listen, if you are one of the people who watches this podcast, but you've been not wanting to join BeitVirtuali, one of the benefits that you get by joining is interactive adult education. And so the question I have for you out there who are not members of BeitVirtuali, what would you like to learn? What would you like to see in a class, a single class or a month-long class or that sort of thing? What would be interesting for you? I've got a few ideas now, but I haven't put the rest of my agenda together for this year because I'm really wanting to hear from you. What would be interesting enough for you to want to join BeitVirtuali? So there's my question for the day, because I'm willing to teach that class. Not a whole lot I'm not willing to teach. So, because it's going to force me to read something else, and that's going to get me really excited.
Yep.
There it is. Thank you all for being a part of BeitVirtuali. Let us know what you think. Like this, pass this on to someone. We only stay on and grow with your help. So send those likes, subscribe to this channel if you haven't. And with that, we will see you next week at this time. Take care, everyone.
Take care.